we speak about international tribunals, but global justice is actually, as I understand it, very much also about local justice, about seeing justice done in different ways in different places. And you, over the past decade, invested an enormous amount of effort into legal empowerment.
It's the legal empowerment of the poor.
Yes.
And access to justice. And we talked about property rights. By the way, Hernando loved what Larry Summers said, which was nobody ever washes a rented car, which means that people do not take care of the land if they don't really own it. And so, and then we had business rights, labor rights, and access to justice. For out of 8 billion or 7 billion people in the world, there may be like 5 billion that have no access to justice. And so that is very much a part of democracy.
Yeah, and a part of the Institute's agenda. A final question on the strides made, because we spoke about war tribunals, but you've lived you were there during Rwanda. You were at the United Nations as an ambassador. You were in office at the time of Kosovo. You've lived through the whole development of thinking on humanitarian intervention, the rise of the notion of the idea of the responsibility to protect, that there is a world community which at times has to step in terms of mass human rights violations. How do you these days look at the discussions on Libya and Syria?
Okay. First of all, I think I was at the UN, I think, at a very interesting time. At the beginning of the 90s, after the freeze of the Cold War, when the UN really began to look at how it could take care of the responsibilities that had been set up when the founders started it in 45. And peacekeeping operations began to evolve. There had existed peacekeeping operations, but more broadly, that would actually get more involved in what were regarded as internal fights. There were lots of questions about whether that was appropriate or not, and then who participates in them, and what are the responsibilities of the international community towards human security. And why do we interfere in the internal affairs of other countries? And I think that what has really happened is, as a result of increased information, I think we know everything that's going on inside every country. There are arguments, I would not be one to make them, that people did not know what was going on during World War II. We now know everything. And therefore, the question is, if you know it, and there is some mechanism for dealing with crimes against humanity or to prevent genocide, that we have a responsibility to do that. I was asked recently by the U.S. Institute of Peace to do a task force on the prevention of genocide and how one does that in terms of warning signals, how the diplomatic community works on trigger mechanisms to understand. And we were talking earlier about the importance of doing conflict resolution before people start killing each other. And now I've been asked actually to do a task force on the responsibility to protect. It is a fascinating doctrine. It is a part of the United Nations. But who does it and how? And when is responsibility to protect actually aggression into somebody's country? The Security Council Resolution 1973, which has an element of the responsibility to protect within it, is a very interesting example. And the question of who carries it out, in this case NATO, is it appropriate? One of the issues that is really, really hard is that I believe that it's important to have moral foreign policies with consistency of principle, but unfortunately, as a former practitioner, you become pragmatic and you can't do everything everywhere. And so I think that one of the things that will be for the Institute to look at is what are the kind of the rules about all this, and then to have people that are a part of it who can in fact say, okay, we can do something here, but we can't do something there. And to put it back into a law discussion is, just because you can't catch every burglar, does it mean you don't catch the ones that you can? Well,
that's a beautiful thing. And the tension between principles and pragmatism, and that's also the hard tension, and the need to draw on practice, on practical experience, as can be done here in The Hague for the Institute. Well, you, as the other panelists, Dr. Hussein, you straddle practical experience, knowledge. You've worked in all these fields. One of the exciting, I think, items on the agenda of the Institute is peace diplomacy, peace building, weaving human rights, the rule of law into process of peace building, making sure that principles don't disappear when practice comes around. In your long experience, what do you look back at as a particular successful example of peace negotiations where law and peace building did meet? It's a big question, and
It's a big question, and this is where I think this institute will have a very creative and productive role to play, because, you know, what can we learn from our past experience? We can look back at the experience where attempts at preventing conflict succeeded. Attempts which you didn't succeed, you can learn from failures as well. Why did we not? You know, the experience of Rwanda, we all now recognize that, you know, that was somewhere General Dallaire's evidence and so on. That in future, timely intervention must be needed. That was one of the UN's admitted failures. But from all of these, we need to look at them in order to anticipate the future.
Yeah.
And for this, you really needed this institute. It's a response to the felt need all over the world.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy, and I congratulate the founders for responding to a global need. And the minister also, I found, showed that response sensitivity to a felt need all over the world. You know, 193 states, if you were to take a head count, all of them would say we need it.
Yeah.
We need to learn from the past experience so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in future. We can anticipate, see the early warning signs, and have the right to, or the duty to protect could be invoked. So this is where imaginative studies, listening to voices which have not been heard. There are victims of violations of human rights, victims of gender inequality, victims of poverty, victims of different types of injustice scattered all over the world. Their voices need to be heard. I think that is a kind of research that is urgently needed.
And if you would have to, if they would give you an office at the Institute and they would say, ask you, Dr. Husain, write down one case study, share one case with us where this was successfully or maybe not successfully heard, where we didn't listen to the right voices, or we did at the time, what experience would you, as one of the practitioners that the...
You see, the part success, but you know, it's a continuing challenge is Afghanistan. That is something, Madam Secretary also has been deeply engaged in the problems of Afghanistan. She's seen the refugees in the refugee camps.
Yeah.
6 million of them. I came at a point where there were 6 million, there are still 4 million of them who've been refugees for 20 to 30 years. And little kids who've been born in a refugee camp are now 20 years old. I remember seeing a little girl, it must be 15 years ago. I mean, she must be now a full-grown, woman. And they're still in refugee camps. But where I said we made some progress was, after 9/11, there was a very decisive intervention. And it fell to my lot to make the first report. I went through minefields 2 or 3 days after this, the coalition effort started. And I was among those who were able to say that, yes, the people in Kabul felt that this was welcome. The fact that they were being liberated from the kind of oppression that they'd been subject to. Women teachers had not been able to teach. You know, the 80% of school teachers in Kabul were women. They had been told to go home and not to teach. So they were able to come back, resume their life, and so this was a success. The fact that the process had begun of Afghanistan being restored to its people, and the refugees that I went in the camps, they said, "When can we go back? We are keen to go back," and about 1 to 2 million came back, but then the process stopped. And this is what we have to learn from why something which could have been a tremendous success. Vice President Biden, I heard him speak on an occasion, and his speech was entitled, "Afghanistan Squandered Opportunities." And I went up and shook his hand. And I said, this was when he was just Senator Biden, not Vice President. And I said, you've just got it right, because seeing this thing on the ground, I do feel this is such great opportunities to allow 4 million people to come back home after 20 years. It's a devastated country, irrigation systems blown up, infrastructure destroyed. Other communities have been, sort of scattered. So among the recommendations we have made, and this is where I think the Bonn Agreement was made in Bonn, giving a framework, the human rights framework in which the community should be rebuilt so people could go back and live as human beings, enjoying their rights. Women would, and the women were particularly vocal in the urge to go back, saying that, we have suffered enormously under these years. We are very keen to go back and build our country. And I have said that this is, as Secretary Albright has always said, think of non-state actors. Yes, we know there's a transitional government, and we played a part in getting the king, who was in exile in Rome. I went and saw him. He came back, convened an assembly, and a transitional government was set up. So that is going on. And we saw a photograph in the video, President Karzai, and I met him on the first day he assumed power, with a lot of hope. But we'll have to, and I think President Obama, in a very major policy speech, took note of the fact that, yes, where there had been lapses, resources had not been got. So that is one thing. But the real part
and
where I feel,
the non-state actors, the
non-state actors, that is where I say, I think,
point.
Madam Secretary gets it absolutely right. All of these people who've been out of the country have seen the world outside and know that how you can build another society where people can enjoy freedom, people can enjoy human rights, women can enjoy a measure of equality which they've never known before, and communities should be participating. They should be not only building roads and houses, but rebuilding communities. And not just a top-down, but again, the ownership, what the Secretary always says, all the people together must rebuild their own country and make it their own project.